was all good. But at any rate, man, I'm looking forward to getting into your life, your world of music, your latest album, Home Now. So thank you for taking a minute out.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show, and yeah, I'm really excited about Home Now,
Yeah.
and yeah.
So let's get into the album. Before we do, I know that kind of this post-COVID period's fading and the pandemic's kind of getting in the rearview mirror. But was there anything about that time period that affected this recording and your future projects that you've done?
It's a good question. At the end of the day, I don't think a huge amount, although of course that whole time during the pandemic, like it affected everything, I suppose, in some way. But really, the compositions on this record just came about through moments in my life that they sort of, they were inspired by. And particularly, and it was roughly from around the period of 2018 to 22. So it was around that time and very much just inspired by stuff that was happening in my life at the time, and the compositions would come out. And then at the I started to see some I guess synergy between the different compositions, and an album started to make sense. And it was also very much the bringing together of some musicians who I really admire and had worked a little bit with before, and wanted to bring them together on this project for these compositions. So,
So ultimately, Take Me Into the Studio is this vision of this album kind of unfolded. What was kind of the artistic vision that turned into this final product?
so yeah, I didn't set out with a particular vision for the album. It was more the compositions came about as I was saying, and then I brought them together. And yeah, the singer I worked with on this album, Brigitte Baraha, an amazing British singer, and I'd worked a little bit with her. I'd done a series of concerts at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival 8 or 9 years ago, and I wanted to work with her. And when one of the tunes was written, um, she was completely in the back of my mind as the singer I wanted to work with. So already then, the project that was definitely seeding the start of the project. Oh, I want to work with her. You might notice quite a sort of an influence from the ECM records that feature Norma Winstone on vocals, Klaus Giesing, Glacovenia, and that trio with the bass clarinet, the voice, and the piano influenced me a lot. So I wanted to explore that, and so there's two of the tunes on the album, as you'll know, have that trio and that texture, which kind of creates this kind of chamber music, jazz chamber kind of vibe, I guess, what I'm very interested in. And I've done a lot of classical music, or I was brought up in a lot of classical music, so that's definitely a part of the influence there. But in terms of the general concept of the album, it's I've reflected on that more actually after the fact, interestingly, rather than going in there. And the title track, Home Now, very much reflects on the difficulty of having a home in two places, I suppose. A beautiful difficulty, actually, not necessarily a bad thing, but just the experience of that, and then find perhaps even, and it asks the question, well, what is really home? And I want to leave that very open. I didn't want to sort of say, well, for me, home is here or there. It's that, so there's some questions about that, but also it's the album very much represents, I think, me arriving compositionally at a real voice and a real style that feels very much like me at this moment. So
So what are you hoping the listener gets from this album?
I'm hoping the listener will be drawn into the sound world, coaxed in, and will find that their imagination um, takes them to past experiences that they've had, um, helps them to reflect on some of the aspects of being a human being that are perhaps less um, not so obvious,
Yeah.
perhaps. And I think where music like this can really help shed a light on that, and and also celebrate, some of these things. I think the album has a lot of warmth and joy, throughout it, and that was indicative of that time. So there's really, there's really many wonderful things happening for me at that time, and um, so there's the celebration of that. But more than anything, I want to tell the story of the songs and people to be moved by that, and for them to make their own connections with their own experience. Yeah.
So take me back to the beginnings of this life that you have as a pianist and a composer from New Zealand. How did you initially get into the music? What were some early influences on you that have kind of evolved into this voice that you have now in the world of jazz?
Sure. So I grew up in Auckland, New Zealand, and my mother played guitar, kind of folk kind of style. And also, at that time, my family was quite involved in the church, and she led a lot of the church music. So my early experiences as a pianist, I started learning when I was about 5 years old. And then many of those early experiences were a mixture of playing some classical music that I was learning, and also some church music. And that was a kind of music that involved me navigating with chords and doing a bit of improvisation, just very, very light touch improvisation. Um, so that's, I think, an important influence when I then developed an interest in the jazz style in high school. And by that time, I was already quite a serious classical pianist doing competitions and things like that around New Zealand. So by the time I went to university, I was doing my undergraduate. I effectively did a double major in jazz and classical. I convinced the head of music to let me take the some jazz papers as well as my classical. And my teacher, Ray DeLille, was very supportive. I had the same amazing piano teacher from when I was 9 years old to 23, 24 years old. I mean, and that mentorship from her was really, really helpful. And so I continued very much with the focusing on the classical stuff as well going forwards. And then that's what brought me to London after finishing about 5 years of study in New Zealand. I got a scholarship to the Guildhall School of Music, and I did 2 years of studying classical exclusively there for 2 years, and this is 2010 to 2012. And then I learned a lot with that. And then coming out of that university, that was the end of my sort of university period of studies at that time. And the jazz was still a big part of my life. I'd started founding, while I was doing that, I founded a jazz jam session here in London with some friends that met every Sunday. Um, Diving into that freelance world, I found myself wanting to compose, wanting to write, wanting to focus more on jazz. And as my life has kind of grown over here and my freelance career has sort of grown, that's become an increasing focus.
Yeah.
So there's the classical music influence, of course, really important to me. Also, that early church music, even though I'm not involved with that anymore, that has played a big influence. And actually, one of the influences I would point to and have done on another couple of occasions is the Brian Blade and the Fellowship Band, actually. Um, just the vibe of some of that. And that album, Season of Changes, is one of my all-time favorites. And I love the kind of way that the power of that music and the purpose behind it and the way that those compositions work. That was definitely a big influence on some of the more ecstatic moments that you might find in my music that I'm searching, that they're reaching, that searching.
Yeah. Well, in our growth and development, whether we're a musician or a fan of this art form, are those early shows that we catch live that really blow us away and give us that feeling. What was one of the first jazz shows you saw live on stage that just made you think, "Wow, that's amazing"?
Well, the first really top kind of jazz show that I saw was when Herbie Hancock brought a band out to New Zealand. I'm struggling to remember exactly when that was. It must have been in the mid 2000s, like I don't know, 2004, 5, something like that. I could be wrong, but that was I definitely that made a big impression just because it was the first time, to be honest, I'd really heard jazz of like very, very high level. I remember seeing the Bad Plus at Wellington Jazz Festival. That left an impression. There's some really good jazz musicians in New Zealand as well. I studied with Kevin Field, this wonderful pianist. And so he did a jam session every Sunday. So I used to even go every Sunday to that. And even when I stopped taking lessons. And so they made a big impression. And but of course, when I came to London to study, and that was one of the reasons why I love London as well, is obviously there's a lot of great jazz happening here to see and hear and be involved in and be inspired by. Yeah.
So, what is your motivation to continue to evolve as a musician? What motivates you every day to create this music, to compose? What is that energy for you every day?
That's a really good question. As a musician, and I think probably quite a few musicians could relate to this. It's such a vocational thing. My music making and my um, and that musical side to my life is so much a part of my identity. That's how I see it.
Yeah.
So to me, I can't really imagine not doing it. And to me, it's like breathing. It's like it's the natural way that I express. And I think in many ways I've reflected on the fact that it's more natural for me to express some things in music than it is even in talking to friends or whatever. It would be even more natural for me to express, especially some of the more nuanced emotions or intense emotions through music. And so a lot of the music I write is just me expressing what I feel needs to be expressed at the time, and that's my kind of most natural way of doing that is through writing music, through playing music, through improvising. And often, if I'm some of the compositions I've written have been when I've been feeling something quite intensely, and I'll just go to the piano and it just flows out. Whatever needs to come out will come out, and that will be the basis for something. So I've got a lot of voice notes on my phone, little snippets of this, that, and the other that have emerged at different times, almost like musical diary entries, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
And most of my composition to date has been as a result of these sorts of things. Um, at this point, I haven't really gone out I haven't composed large collections of works with an overarching goal yet. That's something definitely I'm planning on doing quite soon, actually. But both Home Now, the record, and my first solo record, the Cornerstone Suite, all of those compositions came about organically in that way.
So, for the purposes, I know you're in the classical and the jazz worlds, but for the purposes of this show, at the end of the day, why do you love this art form that we call jazz?
I think it's the freedom of expression and the risk taking that's essential to it that attracts me to it. And somehow I find that both as a performer in the midst of it and also as a listener, something that really excites both my mind and my heart. And so that mixing of those things together is just means that I find it super exciting to listen to and to play, to be in the middle of it. I if there's nothing that makes me feel as alive as playing in an ensemble and that improvising and really being on that same wavelength and riding that that music together, kind of diving off that moment of departure, that diving off into the unknown together. I mean, that's the most exciting feeling for me. Yeah, so that's what I love about it.
So the show that you saw with Herbie is obviously one of those that a lot of people, that would be a dream show for people to see him live. But for you, especially being a pianist, if you could go into a time machine and go back in time and see one pianist, especially in the jazz world, just to watch them and how they operate and to hear it live, who would that be?
This would be a pianist that's not around today, I'm
Sure.
assuming.
Yeah, yeah, it could be. Yeah.
It could be. Wow, yeah, I think I would love to hear Keith Jarrett again. I heard him once solo live in London.
Yeah.
And but because of his dedication to the moment, like the art of music right in the moment, and of improvisation from nothing, essentially, I would love to go back and hear him, live, um, again and again, because I think it's just so inspiring, that level of dedication to that. He's obviously been an influence. The other person that was coming to mind is Bill Evans, of course. I mean, I know it's a very, very typical answer to a question like that for a
Yeah.
pianist. So influential, of course, but and there's wonderful, footage of him as well, video footage and interview footage, um, which I love seeing. But even that has whet my appetite to
Yeah.
meet the man more. I'd love to meet him, and again, both those musicians, I suppose, they have strong classical, roots that I relate to. And but both of them such a dedication to innovating in the art of jazz as well. And they've got their own voice so
Yeah.
distinctly, within 15, 20 seconds of hearing what they're doing, you're like, you can recognize who they are and how they're playing. And I guess the other thing I want to draw out of those two is the that I think is something that's under or perhaps not as valued by some jazz musicians enough, is pianists especially, is the quality of the sound that they make at the instrument. And both those pianists, Keith Jarrett and like, I feel that they really put a lot of thought and care into the tone quality that
Yeah.
they're making at the instrument. And that's something I care a lot about, and worked a lot on as a classical pianist, and that just naturally flows through into the way I play jazz.
So everyone out there has a perception of you at the end of the day, family, friends, fans, everyone that knows you, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
Wow, that's a that's a big question, Joe.
It's kind of a therapeutic question.
Um, who do I think I am? I don't know where to start with that, really. I think that's a great question. I feel like what will come out will be what I aspire to be.
That's
Uh,
okay.
but yeah, no, I think I'm someone who cares a lot about the sincerity of what I'm trying to say as a musician. And I think probably that's me as well. And as a person, that's important to me. That's a value, I guess. Um, and yeah, what else would I say? I see myself as someone who has grown to not be, and I suppose this is a hard one thing, but not be so concerned as I used to be about needing to do everything quickly. And I've often struggled in the past with a feeling of want of being behind, of needing, oh, you haven't done this, you need to do that, and by this stage in your life or career, you should have done this and this and that. And I think this is a little bit of an overhang from a classical upbringing in some ways, but that's very kind of, you push forwards. But I suppose and I'll loop this back into the album, because I think one of the things in Home Now is there's a sense of acceptance, there's a sense of joy, there's a sense of relishing the now.
Yeah.
And I feel that in my life at this stage, and I see myself as someone who is has got a lot to learn, but this is something that's started to dawn on me, this acceptance of the different, contrasting, sometimes opposing forces in my life, whether it be having a home in New Zealand and having a home in London, whether it be yeah, lots of ambiguities that you sometimes think is a black and white thing, and then you grow to understand actually this is what it's like to be a human.
Yeah.
And so some of that realization, some of that acceptance, some of that peace, um, I think comes out in this album, and comes out in me as a person right now. It's indicative of that, of me now, I think. So.
Great answer. John Paul, the new album is home now. If anyone wants to pick up a copy that will benefit you the most or catch you live, any of your previous work, where's the best place to go?
If you head to my Bandcamp page, you can get all my music there. I have CDs available for home now on the Bandcamp page. Also, I have some vinyl of my first album, The Cornerstone Suite, as well.
Perfect.
And be launching the album in New Zealand, in Auckland, on December the 5th. Um, and if you follow my social media channels and things, you can find out details about that on my website. And and then in early next year, in London, we'll be playing the music at the Vortex in March. So
Okay. Excellent. It was so great to meet you. Thank you so much for taking a minute out today. Best of luck with the release and everything else. I appreciate it.
thanks so much, Joe. Really appreciate being on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And before